American Ag Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. As my listeners know, I love to talk about ag tech and ways to help producers make more profit. And I love talking to inspiring young ag entrepreneurs. My guest today has experience across engineering, management consulting, and international entrepreneurship. She studied chemical engineering at the University of Michigan and received her MBA from Stanford University. She worked in a variety of roles, is committed to agriculture and being a good caretaker of the land. She grew up in Wisconsin, down the street from dairy farms, and that helped her guide her passion for co founding a company focused on supporting farmers who are tackling emissions from the cattle sector. From Stanford, California, I'd like to welcome Nicole Rojas, co founder of Lasso. Welcome, Nicole, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. I'm so excited to be here and, got connected through World Dairy Expo in Madison, Wisconsin. So like you mentioned, proud cheesehead here. So it's great to, come on this podcast that I've admired from afar for some time now.
That's great. Great to hear. So, first of all, tell me a bit about your background. It's very expansive. It covers a lot of things. So, tell me how you got here.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, I'm originally from Green Bay, Wisconsin. I eventually ended up, doing Big Ten undergrad with engineering background. So go blue. So went to University of Michigan. I was really fortunate that early on in my career to have the opportunity for a few years in management consulting to really learn a lot more about what makes a business tick across a variety of industries and primarily for some of the largest corporations in the world. But then on the flip side of that, I've also spent time, diving into entrepreneurship. So working at this data analytics startup and getting a sense for small businesses and what their needs are and what their interests are. And so a huge range there. And that at the end of the day, this experience at the startup was really the catalyst for my view that I want to start my own company, supporting the communities that I care about. So, as you mentioned, across my professional experience of engineering, consulting, and climate, as well as my personal, passion and proud identity as a Wisconsinite, I feel really energized to talk to you today about our startup Lasso that's supporting farmers in their on-farm emissions reduction work and making it financially viable and giving them the credit that they deserve for doing that work.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's all about, when it comes down to it, it's about the farmer and how we can serve them, right?
Yes.
So, how did the idea of Lasso come to fruition then?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I received my MBA from Stanford. And so I went back with the intention of I want to understand a bit more about the intersection of data analytics and climate. So it's a pretty high level, thesis going in, but immediately within the first month, I had this light bulb moment where I realized there was this win-win within the cattle, specifically dairy sector that I'm focusing on right now. Is that how do we ensure that farming becomes both a financially sustainable business but environmentally sustainable? I'll keep talking about this point, but at the end of the day, that sustainability is not just about environmental but also keeping the lights on and being able to pass your farm on to future generations from the
Right.
generations that have given it to you. And so it's this idea that you can sustain communities and amongst this increasing pressure to address climate change. So for me, there was this was this intersection of this interesting problem to solve, which as a former engineer, I was really give me a problem that seems unsolvable, um, and this passion area, like I said, of an industry that's near and dear to my heart. And so the rest of my time in grad school, I spent more time looking into the space, and I heard over and over again talking to different stakeholders across the supply chain in both dairy and beef that one of the biggest hurdles into implementing on-farm emissions reduction projects is data. So what I heard over and over again is, look, the last thing I want to do before waking up, before 5 a.m, finishing up at 8 p.m. every day is more paperwork, going through my different sources of information and trying to fill in another application, for example. And then the second key thing I heard is, this whole, sustainability space or carbon offsets, carbon credits, emissions reduction feels like such a maze. I barely have time to go through this maze and look for myself in terms of what are my options? What's the best option for me? And am I getting credit in the best price for doing those practices? So therefore, this is how Lasso came about. We wanted to remove the headache of additional paperwork, and then provide clarity on, what counts as emission reduction projects and how you as a farmer can get paid for it.
Right.
So, ultimately, just to summarize, and we'll get into, this more, but based on your farm profile and your interests, our product and team at Lasso can find the right project for you and then subsequently identify the eligible public and private funding opportunities for you. And so we will apply on behalf only with your express approval, if that's something of interest to you. And so we'll handle the paperwork, we'll handle, the maze of stakeholders to find you that best price and get you verified for your emissions reduction projects.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And you're totally right about this maze of paperwork and, even just running a business, even my own business. By the time it gets to the end of the day and I have all this stack of paperwork, I don't want to do it. I
Yeah.
just worked all day, right? So this is really, really, really key, I think. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of obscurity over how farms can make money leveraging carbon reduction. And I think there's a lot of haze around it. So, how does it really work? And can farms really make a profit altering practices and recording results?
So first and foremost, yes, absolutely. Farmers do have an opportunity with emissions reduction projects to have them not only profitable, but as a major source of revenue.
Wow.
However, it's very important to note that there is not a one size fits all practice for all dairies in the US. And I think that's really important for so many people in this industry to recognize. I know, producers or, farmers know this already, but I think from a brand perspective, processor, even legislation, it's important to recognize the nuances amongst dairies.
Yeah.
And making that choice, it's important to take in, the individual profile and needs of that farm. So, for example, we were just in Idaho for the Dairy West annual meeting, and then, like I said, you and I were both at World Dairy Expo in Madison, Wisconsin. Dairies in Idaho, do more dry lots, dry, and then in Wisconsin they do more free stall barns. What that means, tactically, is that there's differences in what can you do with your manure, how easy is it to get the right type of manure, or consistency for an anaerobic digester. And so,
Right.
theory, right? Your finances, your farm size might say, yep, you're perfectly eligible for like an anaerobic digester. However, the practices and how you take care of your herd differences, right, based on your
Mm.
region. I think another example is weather. And you and I were just talking before this about the different swings in weather across the
Yeah.
country. So I'm currently in California, but as I mentioned, proud Wisconsinite. And I was just telling you before going back, I have to get out my big sleeping bag coat this time of year, whereas here I can just put on a quick sweater because the reality is the seasons are different and the weather is different. And so what that means is your window of opportunity for cover crops is much smaller in Wisconsin than it is in the Central Valley in California.
Right.
Or even the hardness of the soil if it's frozen from winter. I haven't seen frozen soil here in some time in
I bet.
California. I certainly have in Wisconsin. So there's just nuances there that are really important to take into account for those. So that's a long way of saying that first and foremost, before figuring out what's profitable for you, you have to take into account your size, location, and your practices to make the most financial sense for you. So then when we take into the account, there's three tiers then of how you can make money from these emissions reduction tests. The first is upfront, support. So this is to help, neutralize or lower the cost for a new practice you implement. These are typically government grants that you will see. So for example, if I'm installing a solar panel, there are these REAP grants, essentially that can cover like most, if not all of the costs of that.
Wow.
So there's like an upfront piece. that you can find support for. The second bucket is ongoing revenue sources. And that typically involves carbon credits, and we'll talk a bit more about those, for what's called the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that you are reducing on an ongoing basis.
Okay.
And so based on the type of project, and we'll explain in more detail in just a bit, you can quantify, here's the number of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that are being reduced on a monthly, on a yearly basis. And there's a dollar value assigned to that. And so a company will pay for that to say, okay, this, I'm claiming this reduction and paying the farmer for that work, for example. The third, finally, is just in general, productivity improvements or a lower cost base. So if you're doing energy efficiency project or renewable energy, that ultimately in the long run will save you energy costs, even outside of external revenue sources, which is great. If you're doing no-till, for some farmers, if that works there, you often have lower fertilizer costs and lower maintenance costs. So that's just an overall improvement in your, profitability, right? The final thing I will say, and I know this is a long answer, but I want to give two tactical examples because I know, having spoken to so many different producers and farmers is, okay, how does this pencil out? Can we talk about what are the numbers? So let's take the first example, which I mentioned this a little bit before, but solar power. So if the average farm, let's say a farm has 300 head of cattle, this solar installation will cost around $150,000 upfront. Farmers will qualify, like I said, for these REAP grants, that's REAP, up to 25% and loans for up to 50% of the total cost. So the out of pocket should be reduced to, around $35,000 instead of the $150,000. And we found that when you install solar energy, depending on the seasonality and sunlight, you gain $50,000 a year in energy savings. So it's a payback period of, around 3 to 5 years. So that's one, exciting example we've seen. And then the last one I'll say, and I mentioned this briefly as well, is no-till farming. They found that, and we found that costs are reported usually as half of conventional till growers. And so there's no pre-emergent herbicide that's needed, no tillage passages. So this is for traditional crops like corn. And then this is where you get to the carbon credits piece. That usually qualifies as a benefit of 3 to 4 tons per acre, or about $25,000 in yearly credits for a farm of, 450 acres. So there's examples of this all over. We saw, we talk about one in Indiana that was working with a company and has gotten yearly $50,000 from no-till. So the long and short of it is, first, you have to figure out, what's best for your farm. And then 2, based on that, there is opportunities across upfront costs, recurring revenue, and just overall productivity increases that make this profitable for you.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's a really interesting thing that you're doing and connecting all these dots in the framework, right? Because it's the framework that's scary. So matching producers to grants, how does that work?
Yeah. So you first, like I mentioned in the previous answers, figure out more about the farm profile. Where are you located? What's your size? What are some of your practices today? Based on that, we would identify these different buckets of practices that make the most sense for that farm, based on financial impact, operational lift, and environmental impact. The farmer then will say, okay, I'm interested or planning already to implement these practices. So we take that list and then we showcase then, what are you eligible for farming across,
Right.
like in private sources. The farmer then opts into, okay, I want to apply to this set of funding and get matched with this funding. And so they give us approval then to use their data to apply on their behalf. And so we fill in the paperwork. And then with the final review of the farmer, we will submit that and manage that process of kind of the, tedious and, as you described, kind of back and forth of,
Yeah.
some of the little tasks there. And then at the end of the day, once it's approved, the funding will, be back in the farmer's pockets, either upfront before that project starts or as the project is ongoing over a set time.
Well, that makes sense. And what are the sources of the funding to support this?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, there's both public and private sources. The first is public, and so when I say public, there's government grants, and so there's both local, state and federal grants that help with on-farm carbon reduction practices. And so there's a range of activities there, whether it's from energy efficiency, renewable energy, or some of the anaerobic digester work, or even some of the cover crop no-tills. It depends on your geography. And like I said, it's kind of a maze. And the paperwork there is pretty tedious. So we help with both of those aspects there. The second bucket is private. And I would say that's even more when we've talked to folks, it's even more of a mystery because
Right.
there's not yet a fully set standard. And when I say private, it can come from one within your supply chain. So who your buyer is can pay you a premium, for example, or pay you for your carbon reduction work. It can also be a third party that can pay you that they're offsetting um, their emissions through your emissions reduction work. And so we have, listed out kind of who are those buyers, for example. And when they're looking for specific types of projects, we can match them with the farmers that are doing those projects.
Right. Well, interesting. And is there any way for farmers to choose between where the
Yeah,
credits go?
100%. So it's completely opt-in and that's actually a really important point is we want farmers to be able to choose where their credits are going.
Right.
Uh, in the past, you
Important.
kind of see their credits distributed out for them.
Yeah.
So we had a conversation with a dairy farmer in Idaho last week, and he was saying he was starting a dairy digester project or an anaerobic digester. And one of the buyers in his supply chain, like within it, that wanted to do what's called insetting and claim that credit within their supply chain, they wanted to pay them for that project. However, a oil and gas company also approached them and said, we'd like to, pay you for this project and take credit for offsetting, so outside of our supply chain. And so this particular dairy farmer wasn't sure what the implications would be, what's the best price there, and figuring out what's the best terms that make sense for me. And so we help navigate that as well and provide clarity of can they claim where their credits are going and what price they're getting. So going back to the question on can a farmer choose, where their credit is going, that is, part of our goal, right? That you as a farmer can select where your credit's going and making sure that you get the best price um, for the work that you're doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's important. And so in the industry, measuring the results and the progress of carbon reduction has not been streamlined yet. You've already mentioned that. How can Lasso help solve that problem and try to put some structure to this process?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, a huge issue is with data.
Yeah.
So it's super fragmented. It's sitting across different systems on farm, if at all, today. And so oftentimes when folks are trying to figure out, okay, what's my carbon footprint and what are my next steps, it's often relying on, a life cycle, assessment analysis. And that's really static and often expensive and time consuming for, an actual team to come out and assign everything. There's also, public carbon calculators, but you still have to input, 50 different inputs every time. To your question, as I mentioned before, there's a huge issue with data. It's super fragmented. It's sitting across different systems, if at all, on the farm. And so oftentimes, in order to figure out what is my carbon footprint, it's, a life cycle assessment analysis. And that's static, and it's a kind of a one-time capture that this is what, my footprint is, or this is what is happening on the farm. But it's also expensive. So it's not moving as you change practices on your farm. So every time you change your practice, there's a change on your farm. It's not reflected in, your own data and your own
Right.
footprint. So then, every time you want to use this data in this process of, emissions reductions, of figuring out what is my footprint, what's the best practice for me. When I get that practice verified, like the verify, when I say that, is um, someone else saying that, proving out like, yes, you're doing what you're saying you're doing, right? And then finding funding that for that practice. All four of those applications, you have to manually grab that data, input it, and then update that data.
Right.
And so it's just really difficult, especially if you're managing, as you just mentioned, like your day-to-day operations of your farm. It's just busy, right? I think
Yeah.
the other thing too is, like I've mentioned a couple times, there's a maze. You're working with, in theory, a lot of different stakeholders here. If you have, a project developer that's helping you install the anaerobic digester on your farm, if there's a verifier or governing body, any of these different, stakeholders that you want to share this data with, there's just like a huge hurdle there, and it's quite slow. And so I think that's what, in your question of what's, hurdling some of the progress of carbon reduction, that is a huge one that we saw. And so for us, we have a software platform, right, that will automatically collect that data, manage that data for you, and then use the data only if you want it to be used for these different applications. And so
Mhm.
that means, right, what is your carbon footprint? What is the best practice for my farm? Can I fill in some of these application forms, et cetera, right? And I think the final thing I'll say is that we would use both your own farm data, but then we'd also combine it with any project data that you have on farm. So we can work with external project developers that you're working with, and helping you with your on-farm projects.
Right. Yeah. And I see on the app that you have two columns representing both potential reduction and realized reduction. So, what quantitative measurements are used to calculate those two fields?
Yes. So in terms of, for the different practices, it depends. There's a set methodology of how do you calculate what the reduction is and how do you
Mhm.
measure what that is. So the first clarification is potential is calculated. So if it's a, you say I'm going to do X practice, we can say then if you are, going forward with X practice, in theory, you should be able to reduce these emissions. Those inputs are often, what does your herd look like? What kind of feed are you, and what amounts of feed are you, like feeding your cattle? What are
Okay.
your grazing practices? What do your utility bills look like? So some of like the basic operations of your farm, and knowing how that will change based on, the practice. Realized reduction, it really more depends on those measurement methodologies.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it can be using just the data that exists on farm, and sometimes it requires more of a physical measurement. So, for example, with soil practices, and we will dive into in just a minute of what specific practices I'm referring to. But with soil practice, you might have to have a probe in there to measure some of the nutrients in the soil. If you're planting trees, having photos of how many trees and what's the thickness of that tree to be able to make those calculations. And
Oh,
there
interesting.
yeah, there are project developers out there that have innovative hardware that makes it less manual. But to clarify, we are the software that's stitching those data pieces together and using those data in applications, right? We are not necessarily having the hardware probes that are measuring actual emissions, numbers on farm, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yep, that makes sense. And so what are some methods that you'd recommend right away to reduce on-farm emissions? And then again, how is that measured?
Yes. So um, first, um, like I said before, the practice depends on your farm profile. So we always say that because first and foremost,
Yeah.
there's not a single source of truth for every single dairy farm in the U.S. So there's four buckets of eligible projects that we look into for our farmers. The first is land use and soil. So that includes silvopasture, which means planting trees on pasture land or grazeland, alternative grazing practices, virtual fencing, cover crops, no-till, and then alternative fertilizer application processes. The second bucket is renewable energy, like I've mentioned before. So solar, wind, and geothermal are the primary ones there. That also would include energy efficiency initiatives that you can do on your farm as well. The third bucket is manure management. So that can include anaerobic digesters, compost bedded pack barns, solid separation or conversion, and then pasture based management. And then the final fourth one, and this is a lot of this is still on the innovation side and not yet at market scale, but we have partnerships with some of these players here, but around enteric fermentation, so some of the feed additives that are being developed there, making sure that we're always up to date on what some of those practices are and what's readily available for our farmers. You asked about measurement. So the measurement also depends on the practice.
Mhm.
So each practice, there's a specific requirement which we keep track of. So for example, for implementing a renewable energy practice, you would just need to send a utility bill. So the reduction of energy consumption that you can basically see on that utility bill, and then you can track the share of renewable energy sources on your farm. Which, by the way, for both of those, if your utility bill or your information is housed in your QuickBooks or in an online form, we're usually able to pull that for you, so you don't
Oh,
have to
that's
check.
great.
Yeah. And another example is right for silvopasture, the planting trees and grazeland. That's where you need more of the physical soil measurements, the tree thickness and tree count. And so we will not, be the ones that are like measuring the soil or the trees, but we can take any data that has been measured by, a third party developer on those trees. But we can store that data.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what you're saying is if say a dairy farm decided to switch out all their old light bulbs for LED, switch
Yep.
out all of their older fans for like core cool fans that are more energy efficient, then they would see that realized um, gain in just their utility bill. Then that's really interesting.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So, we include this in one detailed case studies that we're happy to share, and I'll share my contact information later. But we have more detailed case studies and can look into as well, and that's including the operational lift component. That when we share, hey, what practice makes most sense for you, you will see some practices that are a bit easier in terms of proving out or measuring versus others are a bit of a heavier lift. And so we note that as well. So it's not just a financial calculation, but how much time, because time is valuable too, right?
Yeah.
So how much time is it going to take to implement this and, monitor this new practice?
Right. Okay. So what does it take to introduce Lasso to a farm from beginning to end, onboarding and beyond?
Yeah. So first and foremost, and I'm sure I'll share my contact information at the end, but
Mhm.
please contact us if this is of interest to you and you want to learn more. So we're at www.joinlasso.com. And you can add your email there. And you can also just give me a call at 408-256-1098. And what that looks like and what it's looked like this far is, we have a quick intro call, and can also go back and forth over email, what's ever easiest. But to understand what are your needs and make sure that we can support you in what you're looking for.
Right.
And so in terms of, we then essentially will go through what are the specific needs of your farm. And I've described this process before of how do we find them funding. And so it's this assessment again, to then figure out what's the best practice for you, and find then the eligible sources to match them with. And so it's this kind of hand in hand process. As you mentioned, entrepreneur in this space. And so the product that we have now is that beta product that we're using. And so right now it's actually less software than a lot of, on, one-on-one support throughout this entire process for
Wow.
you. And as you're, we're, have the service and continuing to work with farmers, we're also continuing to automate each piece with software. So it only will get easier over time. And so what that means is we'll give personalized attention to every farmer that we work with. So you'll be working with a human, us, the
That's good to
entire
know.
process. And so we provide that full service across what I described, so
Mhm.
you don't have to. So that's how it works now. And so it's really just as a like reach out basis. And so we are actively taking customers now and figuring out how can we, best support you and make sure that there is a fit and that there is interest in learning more about these practices.
Yeah, that's great. I really like the human element. I always like the human element. So what do you do with all the data that's collected, and is it safe?
That is a number one priority for us, and it's a question we get all the time. Your data is securely stored with us if you give it to us, right? With the most advanced data security mechanisms. So we use industry standards, and so that we're not, doing our own way. Like we follow authentication, encryption, and storage practices to make sure your data is safe. The second key point is your data will only be used or shared on an opt-in basis. So like I mentioned, we will only apply for an application, figure out your carbon footprint, et cetera, when you as a farmer say, please help me with this. I give you my express approval. It's an opt-in basis. And so what that means is, let's say you work with your veterinarian or nutritionist or someone else on the farm that also works with your data. And so you're not the only one that is like handling the data and want to work with us. If you say, hey, my veterinarian can have access, these other important stakeholders on my farm have access, your data is yours, so you can choose what to do with it. And so yes, we can get access to other people if you want to, but you can also not. And so it's up to you. And that's a really important point to us.
Yeah, for sure. That's comforting. And there's one issue that really seems to be a hurdle in the industry, and that's this greenwashing trend. So
Yeah.
some producers don't want to support greenwashing in any way. They live by their values. They are good stewards of the land. They are
Yeah.
making these changes on their own, and maybe have for years, and they don't want to be part of a movement that could actually lead to restrictive farming methods, and that could even then potentially lead to government mandates, as we've seen around the world now. So what do you say to those producers?
One, we agree with you 100%. So part of the reason that we exist, and when I talked about why did we start Lasso, what was the drive behind this, is that we exist to use high quality and accurate data to avoid decisions being made on bad data. And above all, give credit, because then we have that data, to the dairy farmers that are doing the good work, as you described, these good stewards of the land. So what we've seen in this topic is that the main issue is that when these, claims are not proven, not quality, or, vastly overestimated. And so, for example, if there's a non-existent forest that's being sold as like a, offset or some in these carbon programs, and there's maybe a potential like multiple buyers, we want to fix that by having proper data and having those high quality, tangible reductions. And so it's, for us, it's a reminder that so many farmers are doing the good work, and they know it better than anyone else. And so, we want to make sure that everyone knows, and more importantly, pays the right price for it as well. And so we think, what you described in terms of policies, legislation, it should be made, like these decisions should be made on better data. Because if there's misinformation or just a disconnect between what's actually happening versus what people think are happening, I think data can actually be a big tool for that. And so that's our intention in this, as well, so that there's less misinformation and higher quality credit for producers.
Yeah, yeah, good answer. And I have one last question for you. Why do you personally serve the ag industry? You got into this a little bit before, but what
Yeah.
is your greatest passion in all of this?
Yeah. So like I mentioned last week, we were in Boise, Idaho for the Dairy West annual meeting. And I stepped away from our booth to attend a panel on sustainability. And so 3 different dairy farmers were talking on that panel. They each had to answer the question, what does sustainability mean to them? Because the main point is we hear a lot of different definitions of what sustainability means, and often not from the producer, right? And the one that stuck out to me was that his grandfather, he farmed with his grandfather, he farmed with his father, and that to him, sustainability was being able to pass on his farm to his kids. He flashed a photo up of his kids, and then hopefully to their children. And there was just a lot of emotion there. And I think at the end, it just like really emphasized the point home that there's a lot of increasing pressure, and there's kind of the sentiment that this is here to stay, talking about, on-farm emissions reductions. But at the end of the day, it has to make financial sense. It has to be financially sustainable. So the farmer can pass on their farm to future generations to come. And so for me, I mentioned this before, but this area is a win-win situation for me. And this is the quote around for generations to come. On one side, for climate, right? If we're, continuing to treat our planet well, and take care of the land that we're on, that's legacy, or that's sustainable for generations to come. On the other hand, if you can make more financial sense of these new practices, and even can up the revenue that producers have from doing these practices, that's financially sustainable for generations to come. You're setting up the next generations for success there. And so it's bridging this gap between consumers and producers, and aligning, incentives from this financial and environmental perspective. So the final thing I'll end with is my parents' lifelong philosophy has been to serve others. And that's really guided me my whole, life and career. And for me, if I can support, a farmer to find the best practice for their farm at the best price, and get the recognition that they deserve for doing that, for improving both the planet that we live in and the farm that their family owns, to me, that is success. And that's my passion there. So
That's awesome. There is that kind of crossroads of balance of
yeah,
taking care of the land and taking care of these families. And
yeah.
I think that's awesome. So thank you so much for joining me today. What a great conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chrissy. This was great.
Yeah. And thanks to all who are watching or listening. If you want to learn more, the links are provided in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe to North American Egg Spotlight on YouTube, Rumble, Telegram, or Egg Fuse. And the podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Amazon, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And have a great day.